In the flickering candlelight of Windsor Castle's oldest wing, where ancient oak paneling has witnessed centuries of whispered vows and quiet power shifts, Princess Anne personally placed Princess Diana's legendary Spencer tiara upon the head of her 10-year-old great-niece, Princess Charlotte, a gesture so intimate and so charged with history that what was meant to remain a private family rite has now become the defining symbol of a monarchy quietly rewriting its own emotional inheritance. I'm glad you've joined me as we begin to unpick the layers of this quietly seismic development among the most guarded family in the world. It was never supposed to reach the outside world, that candlelit room tucked deep within the castle's oldest wing, where only 3 generations of the direct line had gathered under the soft glow of beeswax tapers that cast long shadows across faces already etched by decades of duty and unspoken regret. Princess Anne, ever the stoic enforcer of royal restraint, stepped forward with the famous Spencer tiara cradled in her hands, like something both sacred and dangerous, its heart-shaped center and scrolling diamond garlands catching the light in a way that seemed almost accusatory after all these years of deliberate silence. In that moment, according to someone close to palace circles who was present in the adjoining anteroom, Anne's inner monologue must have been thunderous with the weight of a private letter she had carried for nearly 30 years, a handwritten plea from Diana delivered months before the Paris tunnel. If something happens to me, protect the next daughter of this family. Let her be strong, but let her be free. Anne, who had once viewed her sister-in-law's emotional openness as theatrical weakness, now felt the slow burn of regret that she had remained silent while the institution slowly isolated and diminished the young woman who became the people's princess. Placing the tiara herself was no casual act of auntly affection, but a solemn vow kept at last, her hands steady yet her eyes betraying the flicker of redemption she had waited a lifetime to claim. Young Charlotte, poised beyond her years yet still a child standing on the cusp of a destiny far heavier than most adults could bear, felt the cool weight settle on her brow, and in that instant, insiders say, something shifted inside her. A quiet awakening of inherited steel mixed with the empathetic sharpness she draws from her late grandmother's legacy, as if the diamonds themselves were whispering that she would not be silenced or sidelined, as so many royal women before her had been. Prince William, usually the picture of composed resolve, was seen wiping away tears with the back of his hand, his mind no doubt racing through the long-term consequences of this single act, honoring his mother's memory without turning it into spectacle, signaling to the world that the Wales branch was ready to claim Diana's emotional inheritance on their own terms, rather than letting it remain locked in vaults and protocol. Catherine stood slightly back, hands clasped tightly in front of her, her expression unreadable to outsiders, yet conveying to those few who truly know her an ironclad maternal approval, the Princess of Wales having long ago chosen never to wear the piece herself out of profound respect for the pain it represented, now silently endorsing its passage to her daughter as the ultimate act of healing and protection for the next generation of royal women. The atmosphere in that room was thick with the pressure of centuries of tradition colliding head-on with raw personal reckoning, the air heavy with the scent of old stone and polished silver, every breath measured because no one present, not even the king's own sister, had consulted the monarch beforehand, a calculated omission that spoke volumes about where real influence now quietly resides within the family. The Spencer tiara itself, that $400,000 family heirloom designed in the classic garland style with its central heart flanked by scrolling diamonds and floral motifs, had adorned Diana on her wedding day in 1981 when she walked into the House of Windsor full of hope that quickly turned to suffocating isolation. It had become for her less a crown of joy than a glittering reminder of the fairy tale that collapsed under the weight of betrayal and public scrutiny. And after her death it was consigned to the vaults with such finality that many assumed it would never again see the light of day, too sacred, too painful, too politically explosive to resurrect. Yet here it was, according to a well-placed source within the inner circle who described the scene in hushed tones, resting on the head of Diana's granddaughter in a deliberate bypass of protocol that skipped over Camilla entirely and even over Catherine, who had made her respectful abstention crystal clear for years. The long-term consequences of this single placement are already being weighed in the most senior corridors. It quietly elevates Charlotte as the emotional and symbolic heir to Diana's humanitarian mantle, positions her not merely as a future spare, but as a potential stabilizer in the evolving monarchy, and sends a subtle message that the women of the family are reclaiming narrative control from the male line that has so often dictated which legacies live and which are buried. William's tears were not mere sentiment. They were the visible crack in his carefully maintained armor, the realization that by allowing this moment he was both honoring his mother and gently stepping into the role of architect for a softer, more emotionally attuned future for his children, one that might heal the fractures his own childhood could not. Yet scarcely had the tiara settled than the carefully constructed privacy shattered, a single shaky, low-lit frame captured perhaps by an unintended device or a momentarily lowered guard slipping out into the digital ether and igniting social media like a spark on dry tinder. Within hours, the footage, unmistakable in its intimacy with Anne's stoic figure towering protectively over Charlotte's small frame, was dominating YouTube channels and royal gossip forums, the very videos titled with breathless urgency spreading across Facebook groups and X feeds, where millions of viewers paused, rewound, and debated every micro-expression in the candlelit glow. A longtime family acquaintance confides that the leak was never part of the plan, that the gathering had been shielded from press advisors and palace courtiers precisely to preserve its authenticity, yet once it escaped, the reaction was immediate and seismic, turning what should have remained a deeply personal transmission of strength into a public reckoning that no amount of official silence could contain. The surrounding atmosphere shifted overnight from hushed reverence inside Windsor's walls to a global frenzy of speculation outside, with commentators hailing it as a new era of feminine agency, while others whispered of rebellion against the old order. The pressure on the communications team must have been immense as they scrambled behind the scenes, well-meaning staff members later admitting in private that the viral spread caught everyone off guard because this was never intended as theater, only as truth. For the family, the consequences stretch far beyond today's headlines. This moment cements Charlotte's path as one of quiet influence rather than mere ceremony, ensures that Diana's story will no longer be managed or muted, but actively rewritten through the next generation, and subtly diminishes the centrality of the monarch himself in decisions that touch the heart of public affection. Someone close to palace circles notes that the absence of King Charles from the gathering was not accidental but telling, his exclusion from this particular circle of trust now fueling the first quiet murmurs of fracture, as if the heir and his aunt had drawn a line in the ancient stone and declared that certain legacies belong to the future, not the present reign. And so what began as the most guarded of family rituals has already become the week's defining royal narrative, a candlelit handover whose ripples will be felt not just in the drawing rooms of Buckingham and Kensington, but in the court of public opinion where symbols carry more weight than any coronation oath. The tiara, once locked away like an inconvenient memory, now sits on Charlotte's brow in collective imagination, forcing even the most cynical observers to acknowledge that the monarchy is confronting its past with a boldness few predicted, and in doing so, perhaps securing its relevance for decades to come. Yet as the world pores over every pixel of that leaked frame, the deeper question lingers in the shadowed corridors of power. What private fractures has this single act exposed? And how far will the aftershocks travel before the House of Windsor finds its new equilibrium? But within hours, the carefully guarded walls of Windsor and Buckingham began to crack under a pressure that no amount of protocol could contain, as word of the candlelit ceremony reached King Charles III in a manner that left him, according to a well-placed source within palace circles, not enraged in the theatrical sense, but quietly stunned, the sort of stun that settles deep in a monarch who realizes his own son and sister have orchestrated a moment of profound symbolism without so much as a courtesy briefing. One can only imagine the inner monologue playing out behind that familiar furrowed brow. Decades of carefully calibrated reign building suddenly feeling gently but unmistakably eclipsed. the weight of the crown he had waited a lifetime to wear now shifting in subtle ways toward the next generation, a generation that seemed determined to honor its ghosts on its own terms rather than his. The king, ever the thoughtful bridge between old duty and new expectations, found himself momentarily on the outside of a decision that touched the very heart of family legacy, and in the tense silence that followed the news, those close to him described an atmosphere thick with the unspoken question of whether this was mere sentiment or the first quiet signal that the Wales branch was quietly redefining where real emotional authority now lay. The long-term consequences are already being whispered in the more discreet corners of St. James's, a subtle erosion of the monarch's centrality in matters of personal inheritance and public symbolism, the sort of slow fracture that history shows can widen over years into something far more consequential for the institution's cohesion. That quiet realization in Charles was soon overshadowed by a far more volcanic reaction from the Queen, whose fury, according to two separate sources behind closed doors, erupted the moment the leaked images were authenticated and placed before her in the private apartments at Buckingham. Camilla, a woman who had navigated decades of public hostility and private negotiation to reach her position, reportedly saw the placing of Diana's Spencer tiara on young Charlotte's head not as a touching family tribute but as a direct, almost personal provocation, a glittering reminder that the narrative she had worked so hard to soften and manage was being wrenched back into the spotlight by hands that owed her no allegiance. Her inner thoughts, confided later to a longtime family acquaintance in a moment of rare candor, must have swirled with the bitter taste of legacy erasure after all the careful positioning, the years of enduring comparisons, and the quiet consolidation of influence around her husband to have this most charged of heirlooms, valued at close to £500,000 and carrying the full emotional freight of a previous marriage, bestowed upon the granddaughter of her predecessor without consultation or deference. The confrontation that followed was, by all accounts, heated yet contained within the thick walls of the private quarters, aides later scurrying through the corridors with that particular brand of hurried discretion that signals real trouble at the top, the air charged with the kind of domestic electricity that money and symbolism so often ignite when control of the family jewels becomes a proxy for control of the family story itself. The atmosphere across the royal households in those first 48 hours was one of barely contained tension, Buckingham's usually measured corridors alive with the low hum of hurried conversations and the rustle of briefing papers being revised at the last moment. Well-meaning staff members exchanging glances that spoke of divided loyalties and the dawning awareness that symbols, once released into the wild, become weapons far sharper than any parliamentary debate. A source within the inner circle described how the communications team, blindsided by the viral spread, found themselves fielding calls from editors who sensed blood in the water, while behind the scenes, the quiet power play over who controls which pieces of history, quite literally the diamonds and the narratives attached to them, laid bare the fault lines that had been papered over for the sake of public unity. Prince William and Catherine, meanwhile, presented a united front of calm resolve that only those who know them well could read as something far more calculated. William's political mind already calculating the long-term benefits of aligning his mother's humanitarian glow with his daughter's fresh face, Catherine's unreadable composure masking the fierce maternal strategy of a woman who has learned through illness and scrutiny that protecting her children's future sometimes requires stepping outside the traditional lines of deference. Their decision to proceed with Anne, bypassing the usual channels, was no impulsive gesture but a deliberate assertion that certain emotional inheritances belong to the Wales household now, a move that cynics might note has turned a simple family tiara into the latest battlefield in the endless royal drama of who gets to write the next chapter. Yet even as the palace trembled with these aftershocks, the long-term consequences began to crystallize with a clarity that no amount of official silence could obscure. A quiet but unmistakable transfer of symbolic power toward the Wales branch, the emergence of what some insiders are already calling a new Windsor women's axis, and the gentle but persistent strain it places on the king's authority at a time when his reign is meant to be defined by continuity rather than competition. One can almost hear the wry observations in the more seasoned corners of court life, the knowing acknowledgement that in royal families, as in any other, jewelry is never just jewelry. It is currency, it is memory, it is the tangible proof of whose version of history will endure. The public, of course, saw only the beauty and the poignancy, flooding social media with praise for the gesture's warmth, while inside the walls the fracture lines deepened, leaving Charles to contemplate a future in which his own sister and son had chosen to act first and explain later, a precedent that could echo through the remaining years of his reign with consequences far beyond one glittering headpiece. The pressure on all involved must have been immense, the weight of centuries of precedent colliding with the very modern need to remain relevant in an age that hungers for authenticity over ceremony. And behind the visible drama of stunned monarchs and private eruptions lay something even more calculated, a deeper alliance that had been forming in the shadows for years, the sort of strategic sisterhood that no official diary would ever record, but which now stands poised to reshape the monarchy from within. For the past 3 years, according to a source within the inner circle who has observed their discreet gatherings with quiet fascination, Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Princess Anne, the only daughter of the late Queen Elizabeth II, have met with increasing frequency and unmistakable urgency, not in the gilded staterooms of Buckingham Palace where every conversation risks being overheard by courtiers, but in carefully chosen private settings far from prying eyes, sometimes at the Wales's Norfolk retreat at Anmer Hall, sometimes in the understated drawing rooms of Gatcombe Park, always away from the official schedules that might betray their purpose. One can only imagine the inner monologue that drove these encounters, Anne's mind turning over decades of her own strategic silence, that carefully cultivated armor of restraint which had once kept her at a cool distance from what she saw as Diana's more theatrical vulnerabilities, now softening into something closer to redemption as she reflected on the letter she had guarded so long and the quiet promise she had made to protect the next royal daughter from the same slow erosion of spirit. Catherine, still carrying the after-effects of her own serious health challenges, brought to these meetings a fierce maternal resolve sharpened by personal trial, her thoughts no doubt fixed on shielding Charlotte from the very headlines and manipulations that had once tested her own resilience, determined that her daughter would never be rendered peripheral or convenient in the eyes of an institution that had sidelined so many women before her. The atmosphere in those rooms must have been one of understated power, the kind of charged intimacy where two formidable women, both accustomed to operating beneath the surface of male-led protocol, could speak plainly about the patterns they recognized all too well, the way royal women are cherished when useful and quietly diminished when their stories grow inconvenient, and how the monarchy's carefully projected unity often masks the quiet consolidation of influence around the king's inner circle. Someone close to palace circles confides that the conversations carried the weight of shared history, Anne recounting her own years of being underestimated and sidelined while her mother bore the crown's full burden, Catherine listening with that unreadable composure that hides a strategist's mind, both women arriving at the same stark conclusion that if the institution was to survive in a modern age, hungry for authenticity, its women would have to seize the narrative themselves rather than wait for permission that might never come. What emerged from those private summits was nothing less than a quiet pact to protect and elevate the legacy of royal women in ways the previous generation could never quite achieve, a deliberate bypassing of the usual male-dominated channels that decide which heirlooms see daylight and which remain locked in vaults under the control of the crown. The money angle alone adds a delicious layer of intrigue. For the Spencer tiara, that $400,000 family piece with its heart-shaped centerpiece and scrolling diamond garlands, has always been more than jewelry. It is tangible property, an asset that belongs to the Spencer line, yet carries the emotional and political freight of having entered the Windsor orbit through Diana's marriage, and by choosing to place it on Charlotte's head without seeking broader approval, Anne and Catherine were effectively reclaiming a symbol from the male-controlled narrative that had kept it buried for so long. A longtime family acquaintance describes how Anne, once known for her frank dismissal of overt sentimentality, now saw in this act a chance to honor the strength Diana had shown without repeating her suffering, her inner steel finally aligning with a protective instinct she had long kept under wraps, while Catherine's post-illness clarity gave her the courage to endorse a move that would quietly signal to the world that the Wales household was no longer content to play by rules written generations ago. The pressure in those moments must have been palpable, the awareness that any misstep could be painted as rebellion rather than redemption. Yet the two women pressed on with the calm certainty of those who have watched the institution consume its own and decided enough was enough, their alliance forged not in public spectacle, but in the sort of private determination that history shows can outlast any number of official proclamations. At the heart of this pact stood young Princess Charlotte herself, a girl already being sculpted with extraordinary care for a role far beyond the ceremonial, her preparation, according to well-placed sources who have witnessed the extra tutorials arranged on her behalf, extending well past the standard royal schooling into private lessons on diplomacy, European royal history, multiple languages, and the subtle art of balancing public expectation with personal authenticity. Charlotte's striking resemblance not merely in features but in aura to both her great-grandmother Queen Elizabeth and her late grandmother Diana has not gone unnoticed within the family, that poised steel tempered with empathetic sharpness making her, in the words of a source behind closed doors, the perfect vessel for the legacies now being quietly merged. One can picture Anne during their increasingly regular mentorship sessions, the two of them walking the grounds or sitting in quiet corners where aides have overheard conversations about duty, legacy, and how to navigate a room full of voices without losing your own. Anne passing on the same armor of discretion that served her so well while gently encouraging Charlotte to wield it with the freedom Diana was never fully granted. Catherine, for her part, has been shaping her daughter's inner world away from the traditional playbook, speaking to her of identity and courage and the strength that comes from leading without needing a throne, her maternal guidance layered with the hard-won wisdom of a woman who has faced the harshest of public scrutiny and emerged with her dignity intact. The long-term consequences of this grooming are already being calculated in the most senior circles, whispers of Charlotte being prepared not as a spare but as a potential stabilizer, perhaps even a future Princess Royal in her own right, a quiet force whose influence could extend far beyond the ceremonial into the realm of genuine public connection, ensuring that the monarchy's emotional contract with the people is renewed through a feminine lens rather than left to wither under outdated male succession optics. The atmosphere surrounding Charlotte's upbringing has shifted accordingly, from the playful public glimpses of a young girl to something more deliberate, the pressure of expectation balanced by the protective alliance now openly manifesting in that candlelit moment, a public signal that her path will be one of quiet influence rather than passive waiting in the wings. Yet even as this women's axis took shape behind closed doors, the decision to use the Spencer tiara as its most visible expression carried with it the full drama of family quarrels and inherited grievances. The piece itself transformed in that single gesture from a haunted relic of past pain into a weapon reclaimed by the very women who had once been expected to wear their silence gracefully. The tiara, long treated as too charged, too politically explosive to resurrect, now rested on Charlotte's head, not by decree of the monarch, but by the deliberate choice of his sister and daughter-in-law, a move that, according to insiders, carried the unmistakable message that certain legacies belong to the women who live them rather than to the institution that manages them. One cannot help but note with a touch of cynicism how quickly symbols become battlegrounds in royal households, where a £500,000 heirloom can speak louder than any press release about who truly holds the power to shape the future narrative. The long-term ramifications stretch well beyond the immediate family tensions, positioning Charlotte as the anchor of a new era, the girl who will walk both alone and beside, equipped with the intellectual and emotional tools to navigate the monarchy's evolving demands without being consumed by them. And so, what had been a private pact, forged in quiet rooms and sealed with shared understanding, was about to explode onto the world stage in ways that would send shockwaves across the Commonwealth and turn a 10-year-old princess into an unwitting global symbol of resilience and renewal. And explode it did. The image of young Charlotte crowned with Diana's Spencer tiara sent shockwaves across the Commonwealth, igniting admiration from women's groups in Africa to schoolrooms in Canada, and turning the 10-year-old into an overnight symbol of reclaimed strength. In a calculated countermove, excerpts from a forthcoming biography closely aligned with Camilla surfaced almost immediately, casting cool judgment on Anne's silence, Catherine's ambition, and Diana's memory, a final bid for narrative control that only deepened the visible fracture. Yet it was Charlotte herself who delivered the most affecting reply, a brief, remarkably mature handwritten note thanking Anne and honoring the light of the grandmother she never knew. As cameras later captured her walking quietly beside her great-aunt, one felt the unmistakable shift. In the ancient game of royal power, the women had just made their most elegant move yet,